call the meeting to order and welcome our witnesses and other participants to the Budget Committee's hearing on the fiscal considerations of controlling carbon emissions. Before going any further, let me announce and introduce our most recent addition, Nikki Songus, recently elected from the 5th District of Massachusetts, the widow of Paul Songus, and we're delighted to have you. And the steering committee of our party has appointed her to this position. She hasn't been confirmed yet on the House floor. Oh, she was. Yes. I beg your pardon. You're a full-fledged member. We're glad to have you this morning to participate. The concentration of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide in particular, is gradually increasing in the atmosphere over the past century. It's widely believed to be contributing to the warming of our climate. In light of the damages of climate change, there is gathering momentum in the Congress for legislation that uses market-based mechanisms to limit and eventually to lower emissions of greenhouse gases resulting mainly from the burning of fossil fuels, coal and oil and natural gas. In fact, the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works is holding a subcommittee markup of the Lieberman-Warner bill on the subject today. As Congress considers systems for control of carbon emissions, this committee, the Budget Committee, needs to consider budgetary issues to be resolved in implementing any such system. Our consideration of these issues is not meant to impede implementation of controls, but it is an important part of working out what a system should look like and include if and when Congress adopts one. The most prominent option is a cap-and-trade program for carbon dioxide emissions. Cap-and-trade programs would establish an overall limit on greenhouse gas emissions, declining over time, but allowing producers to buy and sell allowances of permits as needed. By capping emissions but allowing trading, a new and highly valuable commodity would be created, the right to emit CO2. How this commodity is allocated and treated in the budget is a vitally important topic for the Budget Committee to consider. Today's topic is not only important, it is complex, and we are fortunate to have some lucid witnesses on the subject. My Chief of Staff took that word out and put outstanding, but I'm putting lucid here because we put great stock on that. We've asked you here to come explain it to us from your different viewpoints. Dr. Peter Orszag, who is the Director of CBO, will lead, followed by David Doniger, Policy Director for the Natural Resources Defense Council, followed by Bob Greenstein, the Executive Director of the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, and finally Ann Smith, who is the Vice President of CRA International. Before turning to our witnesses for their testimony, let me ask Mr. Ryan, our ranking member, for any opening statement that he may wish to make. Mr. Ryan.
I thank you, Chairman. Before I make my opening statement, I simply want to recognize something that's pretty important here, and today's your birthday. So simply wanted to say happy birthday.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I had hoped we couldn't put that on the record.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say what birthday it is. Thanks for holding this hearing. There seems to be broad agreement that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are accumulating in the Earth's atmosphere. There also seems to be broad agreement that man is creating carbon dioxide emissions, primarily through the combustion of fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and natural gas. There is far less agreement, however, about what this may mean for the planet's climate over time. While this is very clearly a worthy debate, the Budget Committee isn't the place for weighing the science of global warming. We'll leave that to the other committees with expertise over that issue. What this committee can and should do, though, is examine the economic and budgetary implications associated with different approaches to reducing carbon emissions. We all want to be good stewards of the planet. So if keeping our planet healthy means we must reduce carbon emissions, Congress and the public have got to recognize that there are going to be trade-offs involved. First, any increases in regulations and costs imposed on energy producers will be passed on to consumers directly in the form of higher prices, and those with lower incomes will be hit the hardest. Second, the rise in energy costs will have a suppressing effect on economic growth, and without a strong and growing economy, our options for addressing environmental challenges in the future will become extremely limited. I'll note that some have suggested Congress create yet another mandatory program to help consumers offset the higher energy prices that would result from regulating carbon emissions, but we already have an unsustainable rate of entitlement growth. We should not keep making promises that we simply can't keep. Finally, we also must recognize the international dimensions of this issue. According to the Congressional Research Service, the United States currently accounts for about 20% of global carbon emissions. and our share of emissions is expected to fall in the decade ahead as large countries such as China and India continue their rapid growth. So in short, we're not going to fix anything simply through our actions alone. It must be a global, worldwide effort. We should also start to look beyond the government mandates to reduce carbon emissions. We've got to look toward research and development from both the government and the private sector. In short, I think we need to spend a little less time writing government mandates and a little more time advancing cleaner methods of producing energy America needs. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for having this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan. And just one housekeeping detail before we move on with the testimony. First of all, I ask unanimous consent that we include in the record for this hearing testimony which has been submitted by Representative Norm Dix of Washington. I also ask unanimous consent that all members be allowed to submit a statement at this time, at this point in the record. If there's no objection, it is so ordered. Dr. Orszag, thank you for coming. You can proceed with your testimony. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ryan, members of the committee. Global climate change is one of the nation's most significant long-term problems. The accumulation of greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, will impose economic and social costs, including through rising sea levels, altering agricultural zones, and increasing the severity of storms and droughts. There is furthermore some risk that those costs could be catastrophic. For example, if the thermohaline circulation stopped or if there were a breakdown of the West Antarctic ice sheet. In effect, we are conducting an experiment with potentially quite dangerous consequences and no backup plan. Mitigating those risks requires some reduction in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, which can be thought of as an insurance policy against the severe risk or the severe costs that could be entailed in the further accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Most analysis suggests that this insurance is worth purchasing. That is, a well-designed policy to reduce emissions would produce larger benefits than costs. There would, however, be costs as the economy adopted to lower emissions levels. Those costs would be much higher under a command and control type of approach in which there were, for example, technology standards that were imposed or other rigid approaches to reducing emissions. And they would be lower under an incentive-based approach in which the power of markets were used to seek out the lowest cost possible reductions. There are two basic incentive-based approaches to reducing emissions: a carbon tax and a cap-and-trade system. A tax is generally the more efficient approach for two reasons. First, it allows reductions to occur in the years in which they are cheapest to undertake. And a reduction of a ton of emissions this year is not that much different for the climate, ultimately, than a reduction next year. But the cost of those reductions could vary significantly from year to year depending on the weather, economic conditions, the development of technology, and other factors. A rigid cap each year does not allow you to undertake the emission reductions in the cheapest year. A tax does. In addition, a tax provides price certainty to households and to firms, and there can be benefits associated with that certainty. A cap-and-trade system, however, can be made relatively more efficient through various design features, for example, including a safety valve that is a maximum price at which permits would be sold. The government would stand ready to sell permits at some price, and that would put a cap on the price risk or the potential cost of the permits, and also banking and borrowing, which would allow emissions to be basically shifted across years and help address that year-to-year variability that I mentioned before. Under cap and trade, the mechanism for taking emissions down to the cap level is an increase in the price for carbon-intensive goods and services. And it's very important to recognize that a price increase is absolutely essential to having the cap system work. That is the mechanism through which reductions occur, because when you price carbon-intensive goods more, there is shifting towards less carbon-intensive activities and production processes. The size of the price increase would depend on things including the technology available, but especially including the stringency of the cap. The more that you try to reduce emissions, the higher the price increase. It's also important to recognize that that price increase would occur regardless of whether the permits were sold to firms or households or were given away to them at no cost. It is sometimes thought that if you gave the permits away to firms, the ultimate price increases would not occur, and that is not likely to be correct. It is not what has occurred in the European Union, where permits were allocated at no cost and there were price increases that varied from country to country, and it is not what we would expect to occur in the United States either. Those price increases by themselves are regressive because low-income households consume a larger share of their income in the form of energy than higher-income households. So the price increases for carbon-intensive goods and services impose a relatively larger burden on low-income households than higher-income households. But the overall distributional impact of the policy will depend not only on that effect, but also, very importantly, on how the value of the allowances themselves are allocated. We estimate that the allowances would be worth somewhere between $50 and $300 billion a year by the year 2020. And what policymakers decide to do with those allowances could have a very big effect on the overall distributional consequences of a cap-and-trade system. In particular, if the permits were allocated at no cost to firms, the firms would obtain that $50 to $300 billion. And just to put that in context, profits for U.S. producers of oil, gas, and coal over the last 10 years have averaged less than $70 billion a year. So relative to existing profits, those permits would be extraordinarily valuable. Furthermore, allocating the permits in that way would exacerbate the regressivity of the underlying policy because the shareholders in those firms tend to be disproportionately higher income households. The alternative is to auction the permits, in which case the $50 to $300 billion a year could be used to reduce the deficit or used to reduce other taxes. This approach could attenuate the distributional effects if the money was used to cushion the blow, especially for the poor, and it could also potentially reduce the macroeconomic consequences if some of those funds were used to reduce other distortionary taxes, including the individual income tax marginal rates and corporate income tax marginal rates. In particular, because giving the permits away to producers would disproportionately benefit high-income households and would preclude the possibility of using the allowance value to reduce the macroeconomic costs, such a strategy would appear to rank low from both a distributional and efficiency perspective. The final part of my testimony addresses the scoring of cap-and-trade systems under our role as the Congressional Budget Office in the budget scoring process. This is an important topic, but has received little attention to date. If the permits were auctioned, it's fairly clear that the revenue collected would be scored as revenue, and then depending on what was done with those funds, there may or may not be an outlay associated with the activity. If the permits were given away, however, the scoring is less clear. There is a solid case to be made that given the depth and liquidity of the secondary market in these permits, that giving a firm or a household permits worth $100, which they could immediately transform into cash, is effectively equivalent to giving that firm or household $100 in cash, and therefore giving away a permit should be scored as an outlay and a corresponding revenue with no net effect on the budget deficit. That kind of treatment would put on equal footing two transactions that economists believe are equivalent. Selling the permits for $100 and then giving $100 to particular firms and households, or simply giving $100 worth of permits to those same firms or households, which they can then immediately and easily transform into cash. On the other hand, existing scoring, for example, for the sulfur dioxide program, does not treat permits that are given away at no cost in this manner, and the federal budget remains a primarily cash-based thing, and the transactions involved in giving away permits are not cash, they're just quasi-cash transactions. This scoring issue is something that CBO will be examining over the coming months as cap-and-trade proposals move through committee, and we are forced to decide one way or the other how to score permits that are given away. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Orzag. Let me add to the housekeeping details. Previously, the typical stipulation that all of your statements will be made part of the record so that you can summarize them as you see fit. Now we'll go next to, I believe it's Dr. Doniger.
Turn your mic on.
push the button down. I think it'll work. Push it and hold it. Hey.
Okay, now it's working. I'd just like to say I'm only a Mr., but I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ryan, for the opportunity to testify. I'm David Doniger. I'm the Policy Director of the Climate Center at the Natural Resources Defense Council. I'm here on behalf of our 1.2 million members and supporters across the country. A discussion about global warming, in my view, needs to start very briefly with some words on the urgency. And I wonder if I could have the slide shown there. We're already suffering dangerous impacts from global warming. We used to think it was off in the future. It's upon us now. There's a strong consensus in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that won a Nobel Prize recently, that global warming is occurring as human caused. It's within our power to control. The picture here shows the loss of Arctic ice at the summertime minimum since 1979. 40% of the Arctic ice has melted away this past year in comparison with 79. As Peter mentioned, we have the danger that the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet would melt, triggering over a longer period very, very large sea level rises, 21 feet from either one of those melting. We have the expectation of more wildfires, like the one that's been suffered in California. I'm not here to say whether that was or was not definitively caused by global warming, but it is of the kind that we will see more of, because there will be stronger droughts occurring as a result of global warming. There will also be stronger hurricanes, like of the kind we saw hit New Orleans in Hurricane Katrina. The Center for Disease Control, when it isn't being censored, acknowledges that there are public health impacts. I would point out as well that apart from the warming impact, the oceans are soaking up a great deal of carbon dioxide. This is increasing the acidity of the oceans, and scientists are now predicting that coral and shellfish may lose the ability to lay down shells as a result of the changing acidity of the oceans. In our view, we need to hold the future temperature increase. We've already had about 1 degree Fahrenheit already occur this past century. We need to hold the future increase under 2 degrees more Fahrenheit in order to avoid the worst effects of global warming. And this will take a declining cap on the emissions imposed here in the U.S. by our industrial partners and eventually as well by developing countries. In the U.S., we need a cap that would be reducing emissions by 2020 on the order of 15% and on the order of 80% by 2050. That's the sort of specifications that Mr. Dingell, at least at the strong end of the range that he's talking about. There's a bill approaching that was just marked up by Senators Lieberman and Warner in subcommittee in the Senate this morning. My next point is that we can afford this, but it gets much harder if we delay. If I could have the second slide. The first point I'd make before really referring to that slide is that estimates of the cost of these kinds of programs show that the actual effect on our growing gross domestic product is quite minimal. I'll submit a study for the record that was just done by the Duke University Nicholas Institute that shows that by 2030, if we don't have a program, we'll have GDP growth on the order of 112%. If we do have a declining cap like the Lieberman and Warner proposal, the growth would be 111.5%. And by 2050, 238% growth expected. If you have a climate change program, that might be 236.5%. Very small differences in our growth. But the longer we wait, and this is what this slide illustrates, the harder it is to meet these kinds of targets, because you ramp up the emissions to a higher point, and that means the ramp down has to be much steeper in a shorter period of time. So a slow start means a crash finish, and that's why we think it's so important for Congress to act, to pass this kind of legislation without further delay. A cap and trade program with complementary policies such as performance standards for efficiency and incentives to help achieve these standards and move new technologies is, we believe, the most efficient and effective way to meet carbon limits needed to curb this kind of serious impact. And I believe there are tools to smooth out the costs, to control the costs, such as banking and borrowing, which Dr. Orszag mentioned. We are, however, opposed to including a safety valve. The fundamental problem with a safety valve, as that term has come to be used, is that it breaks the cap. You just keep printing more allowances, and we don't achieve the environmental protection objectives that are needed. One or two other points. The key thing is to look at these allowances, as Dr. Orszag has said, as a public asset, something that should be used for public purposes. Those can include promoting new technologies such as renewable energy and the faster deployment of efficiency technologies, to promote the faster take-up of carbon capture and storage by coal burning facilities, to retool Detroit to help make vehicles that fit the profile we need for a carbon-constrained world, to have greener buildings and lower energy-consuming appliances, and to rebuild electricity companies' demand-side management programs to reduce energy. These are some of the technology-oriented uses that can be made of the value of the allowances. There's another dimension, which I know Bob Greenstein will talk about in greater detail, but with our full support, that one needs to use a very large, probably the largest part of the value of these allowances to protect low and moderate income people who will be seeing the cost increases associated with the cap. There are vulnerable workers and communities in certain other industries which deserve to have some assistance. There is a need for spending to protect and restore ecosystems on land and in our coastal and ocean resources. My last point is, though, I would urge a distinction between ends and means, between the public purpose of the allowances and the tool of auctions. Auctions is a very good tool, but not the only tool available to achieve the public purposes that I've been describing. Some of these purposes can be achieved by having allowances go by formula towards certain objectives. For example, the tax code already includes production tax credit for wind energy, for example. That can also be funded, or similar things can be funded, with a production allowance credit. Perhaps a certain number of allowances go to a coal burning utility that stores the carbon safely geologically underground. A certain number of allowances would go to the makers of super efficient vehicles or super efficient appliances. These can be done by formula. They can also be done by raising the money through an auction and spending the money out by spending formulas. The key thing in using all these tools is the need for stability, for dedicated resources that are stably allocated for multiple years, because the investors, the marketplace needs to have clarity, not only coming from the cap, but clarity about how the allowances are going to be allocated so that smart investment decisions can be made. And to go back to the production tax credit example for a moment, the wind energy industry has suffered because the tax credit in that instance has come on again and off again several times. So you have booms and busts which are triggered by the presence or absence of that tax credit. Stability is important, and in that sense, direct allocation, directed spending, tax incentives that on a multi-year basis are, in our view, to be preferred over using the annual appropriations process to achieve these purposes. I'd be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Doniger. And now Bob Greenstein.
Promoted again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My focus will be on the potential effects of climate change legislation on the federal budget and the budgets of American families, especially those of modest means. Our analysis indicates that Congress can develop climate change policy that is environmentally sound, fiscally responsible, and that treats low-income families equitably. But to do so, the policy has to be well designed. Our analysis of these issues is summed up to a significant degree in 4 sets of numbers that I would now like to discuss. The first number is $750 to $950 a year. That is the average increase in energy-related costs for households in the poorest fifth of the population from a relatively modest reduction, 15%, in emissions. As Dr. Orszag noted, effective policies to reduce emissions work in part by raising prices for fossil fuel energy products, and that'll raise prices to consumers for a wide array of items, from heating fuel to gasoline, electricity, food, mass transit, and various other products and services with energy inputs. As Dr. Orszag also noted, households, and I think Mr. Ryan also noted, households with limited incomes will be affected the most, since they spend a larger share of their incomes on energy-related products than more affluent households do, and it should be noted that lower-income households also have less ability to afford investments that can reduce their energy consumption, like buying a new, more fuel-efficient car or replacing your heating and cooling system with a new one. This means that if climate change legislation is passed, but nothing is done to protect people of modest means, many of them will slip into poverty. Those who are poor will become poorer, and the trend towards widening income inequality will be aggravated. $750 to $950 a year is a particularly large number when you reflect on the fact that the average income of households in the bottom fifth of the population is a little more than $13,000 a year. Figure number 2 you've already heard from Peter Orszag, $50 billion to $300 billion a year, which is the Congressional Budget Office's estimate of the resources potentially generated by climate change policies that could be used to assist low-income consumers and address a range of other climate change-related needs. In other words, this would be the amount that would be raised if the government auctioned off permits under a cap-and-trade system, because it is the expected value of the permits that would be created. Figure number 3 is approximately 14%. This is the share of the auction proceeds that we estimated would be needed to fully offset the increased energy costs faced by low-income consumers and provide some relief to moderate-income consumers as well. In my written testimony, I set forth a series of principles. We elaborate on them more in a paper that's on our website for how to effectively and efficiently, without new bureaucracies or big administrative costs, provide this kind of relief so that we would fully offset the impact on the poorest 20% of people and provide some relief to many hard-pressed families in the next 20% as well. We estimate that that could be done with 14%, that's 1/7 of the resources that would be generated by auctioning off all the permits in a cap-and-trade system. And because the resources would come from the revenues the new system created, it would not increase the deficit or put any pressure on the budget. It would be part of the self-contained system that climate change legislation created. Of course, there are other legitimate claims that arise on the budget from climate change legislation as well. Beside the need to protect vulnerable population, these include basic research into alternative energy sources, as Mr. Doniger noted, assistance for workers and communities that depend on the coal industry and other industries that will be most affected by the shift to a less carbon-intensive economy. In addition, I want to note, of particular interest to this committee, I would think, higher energy prices will raise costs to federal, state, and local governments. They consume energy-related products. For example, the single largest consumer of energy in the United States is the U.S. Department of Defense. not surprisingly. What that means is that if those costs are not offset, either federal deficit will rise or government services will have to be reduced or taxes raised. But this too can readily be addressed. If one auctions off the lion's share of the permits, one can take the appropriate fraction of the permits or the proceeds from an appropriate fraction of the permits, use them to offset these costs so that the net effect on the federal government is a deficit neutral effect. My fourth and final number, and could you put up the blue slide at this point, the one called Well-Designed Climate, thank you very much. My final number is also from the Congressional Budget Office, and this is 15%, actually technically a little less than 15%. This is the share of the potential resources from auctioning off permits that the Congressional Budget Office, based on a thorough review of the literature in the field, estimates is needed to compensate energy companies and other emitters for financial losses due to climate change. This indicates that about 85% of the permits could safely be auctioned, a quite sufficient amount to meet the legitimate budgetary needs and to avoid increases in poverty, increases in deficits, to fund the necessary basic research into alternative energy sources, and so forth. So the real bottom line here, as we see it, is the need to ensure that needed legislation to address global warming that uses a cap-and-trade system, if it does, auctions off the bulk of the allowances, gives away those needed to make emitters whole, but auctions off the rest, rather than giving away more than is needed to make emitters whole by giving too many of them away free to energy companies. Again, CBO's estimate of the evidence is about 15% would be needed to offset the effects on energy companies, and I believe the term CBO has used is windfall gains for what would result if significantly more than that amount were given away free to the companies. I looked yesterday at a recent piece written by Greg Mankiw, the former chairman of President Bush's Council of Economic Advisors, one of the nation's most distinguished economists. Dr. Mankiw in this piece notes that if you had a cap-and-trade system that gave away to the energy companies more than was needed to offset their costs, what you basically would be doing would be to establish a very, very large program of, Dr. Mankiw's term, corporate welfare. I would also note, and I'll be very brief here because Dr. Orszag already really covered this, that the main argument one sometimes hears for giving away more of the permits is the claim, well, if you give them away, prices to consumers won't go up, but if you auction them off, they will. As Dr. Orszag has noted, that belief is simply not correct. It defies the basic laws of supply and demand, and I doubt that many, if any, economists, regardless of where they are on the political spectrum, would subscribe to that view. So, in conclusion, well-designed climate change policy can generate sufficient resources to meet legitimate budgetary claims that arise from the policy. If we do a cap-and-trade policy, that means that it's necessary to auction off most of the permits. If that is done, the proceeds can be used to avoid increasing poverty, increasing deficits or debt, and also allowing resources to fund alternative energy, shield coal mining communities, and the like. The key, again, making sure that we auction off the appropriate share of the permits rather than failing to meet budgetary needs, failing to meet the needs of low-income families, and erecting a new program of corporate welfare instead.
Thank you, Mr. Greenstown. Now, Dr. Smith.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to participate in today's hearing. I'm Ann Smith. I'm a vice president at CRA International. My testimony today reflects my own research and opinions and not any positions of my company, CRA. Today you've heard a lot about alternative methods for allocating allowances under cap-and-trade schemes, and allocations are extremely important, but they're also greatly misunderstood. For instance, many people seem to be saying that the very large value associated with the allowances can outweigh the costs of a carbon cap, and it cannot. Any policy that cuts carbon emissions will always impose a net cost on society. And there are only two ways that different types of allocation rules could even help reduce that net cost on society, and neither one is being seriously considered by the Congress at this moment. The first of these ways would be to use the auction revenues, rather than allocating some of the allowances, to reduce the drag on the economy that comes from income taxes. CBO has talked about this possibility, and I just want to emphasize that they made the statement, and it's true, that the benefit, the reduction in the drag on the economy that would come from this approach requires reducing marginal income tax rates, which is highly unpopular politically because it's regressive. If you don't reduce the marginal income tax rates, you don't get the benefit in reducing the cost of the policy on the economy. So in contrast, giving tax rebates to households or increasing their tax deductions, that will not reduce the policy's net societal cost, although it will change the distribution of the impacts of that policy. The second way in which allocation values could be used to reduce the net costs of a carbon policy would be to promote the invention of new advanced low carbon technologies. Most of the allocations proposed so far for supporting technology are just subsidies, deployment subsidies, for instance, and demonstration project funding. These do not improve the incentives for breakthrough technology research and development, and that's what's needed in order for those uses of allocations to cut the policy's net costs. So the other types of allocation schemes that are being discussed will only change the distribution of the policy costs, and they will not reduce those costs. And it's important to recognize that the net cost of any of these hard cap bills that are currently being discussed in the Congress are quite large. For example, I've estimated that the current set of bills for hard caps would generate the following impacts by 2020 compared to a case with no carbon limits. Net losses of between $1,000 and $1,500 per year in the average household's real spending power. Net reductions of 2 to 4 million jobs, and reductions in the U.S. GDP of between $300 billion and $500 billion in 2020, which represents a drop of 1.5% to 2.5%. Of course, that drop in GDP would cause a corresponding 1.5% to 2.5% drop in government revenues, approximately. Keep in mind, these costs keep rising after 2020. These economic impacts are substantial enough to warrant a serious discussion about how to meet the proposed emissions targets as cost effectively as possible. Before discussing a couple of ways that we can do this, I'd like to note a couple of other misunderstandings about allocations that I frequently hear and have heard today. First, assertions that businesses require no more than 15% of the allowances to compensate them for their profitability losses due to carbon cap are misleading. We've just seen that in Mr. Greenstein's testimony. It also appears in some form similar to that in the CBO's written statement. I'm one of the 3 researchers whose analyses are cited in support of that 15% rule. And I disagree with this oversimplification. In my written statement, I describe 4 specific reasons why the actual percentage that businesses would require under a real-world carbon cap would be larger than 15%, in some cases much larger. Another misunderstanding is that the view that allocations can protect U.S. companies whose products compete in international markets. As carbon price levels rise, more and more of these types of businesses will cease production in the U.S., no matter what their allocation is. However, as they close their operations here in the U.S., their emissions will simply reappear in another country, one that doesn't have a carbon cap of a similar magnitude. This is called leakage, and even fully compensating allocations to those companies cannot stop it. Short of global cooperation on emissions limits, the only way to stop leakage with a cap and trade would be through border tax adjustments, but these may not be legal under international trade agreements in a cap and trade application. If border tax adjustments are not put in place at the same time that a cap is imposed in the same time period, the only alternative for minimizing this perverse leakage phenomenon would be to place a reasonable ceiling on the price of allowances. This is the idea of the safety valve that's been mentioned in other testimony today. An allowance price ceiling would have some important additional economic merits besides helping protect against unreasonable amounts of leakage. Prices in all cap and trade programs are notoriously volatile, and volatility in carbon prices will translate into volatility in economic performance generally. Even the government should prefer to see stable allowance prices. For example, would large variability in any auction revenues that are going to be used to fund technology deployment programs be of any value when they need long-term stable funding? Mr. Doniger spoke of the need for projects like these to have stable funding, but if it's funded through auction revenues, this funding may not be stable at all if the prices that can be returned in those auctions are quite volatile. Even if the auction revenues were to be simply rebated to citizens, would either the government or the citizens prefer to have variability in the size of their rebate checks? So in closing, be aware that cap and trade schemes are not the only market-based policy option. As Dr. Orszag said at the beginning of his testimony, other options, such as a carbon tax, may be more suitable to the challenge of reducing carbon to the proposed levels that we're looking at without excessive damages to our economy. Thank you for this time. I have a longer written statement that I request be submitted into the record.
Thank you very much. As I listen to the testimony of all of you, you seem to be attributing great dexterity to the invisible hand that moves through a very substantial market, the entirety of the United States. What mechanism would you employ to administer and facilitate the operation of this system we're talking about, a cap and trade system? It obviously can't be turned over just to the marketplace. It has to have some kind of overseer and administrator, it seems to me, to be operative. We'll start with Dr. Orszag.
Let me make 2 points about administration. The first is that you could impose a cap and trade system at different parts of the production process, if you will, either upstream, that is, you know, at the point of an oil or natural gas or coal firm, or downstream in the form of the goods and services that are actually then bought by households. It is almost universally viewed by analysts that an upstream approach would be much more administratively efficient because you have to then monitor many fewer potential sources. So that's the first point. The second point is it is difficult to see how a system of a cap and trade system could be effectively undertaken in the United States without, at its heart, the federal government playing a role in playing an important role in monitoring and enforcement. And that actually then speaks to one of the scoring issue that I was mentioning. In addition to the allowances being very cash-like, it is also the case that the federal government will have to be at the heart of enforcing and monitoring how the allowances are used and whether firms are exceeding their allowances and what have you.
Dr. Doniger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could add, of all the kinds of pollution regulatory programs, the cap and trade system is the most economical to administer. Everything that Mr. Orszag said is true, but it's a much simpler system than traditional command and control systems. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency administers the acid rain cap and trade program, and I don't remember the exact number, but it's with a couple of dozen employees, as opposed to the more command and control portions of the Clean Air Program, which involve hundreds of people. And the fundamental thing, as Dr. Orszag said, is that you have to have systems of monitoring emissions and reporting those emissions, and then making sure that the submission of allowances is made by a company in the number which it owes. In the acid rain program, there's almost perfect compliance. There's a system of monitors in the stacks of the major power plants in this country that gives hour-by-hour readings of three pollutants, one of which is carbon dioxide. So we already have, under the Clean Air Act, all the data necessary to implement this program for the electric power industry. And there's equally good data on the amount of fuel that moves through refineries. Various other statistics are already out there and collected by government agencies, from which you can either directly measure or infer the amount of CO2 that is released there or will be released when the fuel is burned by households or by cars or whatever. So the system is actually quite economical. It does depend on there being a penalty which is larger than the market price. So most of these bills have, as a rule of thumb, that the penalty for not submitting allowances is on the order of 3 times the price of an allowance. And that's why you get such ready compliance, because it always makes sense for a company to turn in the number of allowances it owes rather than...
Is this a self-certifying system then?
No, at least with the acid rain program and a couple of other programs of the same nature, companies file reports. They are is a violation of law to mislead. There are extensive records which are kept, which are quite good at preventing that kind of misleading. But you do need a government authority, and the EPA or another agency, which has the power and the resources to check and audit, and when it finds problems, go after violators. But it is a very economical system compared to many other kinds of pollution control systems.
Mr. Greenstein, you've been around the government a long time. What NRDC is proposing is a slight increase over time, less than previous. I think it's up to 450 million parts of 450 ppm or whatever it is, and then it drops down by 80% over the next 50 years. Can that be accomplished, in your view, without some sort of strong oversight by the federal government?
I'm not an expert on these aspects of environmental policy. My testimony really focuses on the areas we know: fiscal policy and distributional effects on low-income households. The only thing I would note on this front is that if the Congress enacts legislation that phases various things in over time, you probably want to design it in a way that minimizes the potential for future Congresses to undo the phasing in of the controls over time. Having said that, certainly both the economic price and the political difficulty of going in one fell swoop to the full degree of reduction in emissions one would like to achieve would make that impossible. I don't think there's any alternative but to phase in the reductions in emissions over time. Given that there's no alternative to do that, I think it means one designs the legislation in a way to try to maximize the potential for the reductions to stay in place and to minimize the potential for future policymakers to undo them before the goal is reached.
Dr. Smith, what do you propose for the oversight, administration, and implementation?
Well, if you're going to have a cap and trade system, you definitely need to have sound monitoring and good sound enforcement. I don't think that you need any sort of oversight board to interfere in the marketplace per se. and you definitely would not need that if you had a safety valve price. But I do want to comment that Mr. Doniger said that of all the types of emissions regulations that are possible, cap and trade is the easiest to administer. This is simply not true. A carbon tax would be far simpler to administer. There would be no auctions. There would be no volatility to worry about. There'd be far fewer worries about possible market manipulation that could occur. You'd still need to have the enforcement and the monitoring, of course, but the issues would be much simpler. And the analogy to the SO2 market for a CO2 market is actually a very poor one. The SO2 market applied to a few thousand individual electricity generating units, all of which were already highly overseen by regulators in the first place, and a very uniform market. With CO2, we're looking at thousands of more sources, all sorts of sectors of the economy, encompassing other types of gases even than CO2, and even CO2 sequestration activities, which are taking CO2 out of the atmosphere rather than emitting. All of these make for a far more complicated sort of marketplace to monitor and enforce.
In your testimony, this is my last question, but you do raise a difference between your viewpoint and Dr. Doniger and Dr. Orszag. That is, you question the assertion that emitting businesses would require less than 15% of the allowances to compensate for losses due to the carbon caps. You call these misleading and maybe even suggest you have been miscited. Would you like to explain to us why you think the 15% is misleading?
Certainly. I will say that that literature does demonstrate that you don't necessarily need to give 100% of the allocations to businesses in order to compensate their profitability losses. The 15% is the oversimplification and the suggestion that it is a very small percent. For instance, the models that have produced that number have always assumed that the allocation would be a permanent, infinite horizon allocation year over year all the way into the future. As you probably are aware, most real-world applications of cap and trade for CO2 involve a phase-out of those allocations, perhaps as short as 10 years, as one amendment over on the Senate side says today. With a phase-out like that, you're going to get less value from your allocations because you'll get them over a shorter period of time. And you have to, nevertheless, achieve the same amount of compensation because the costs go on forever and they continue to rise. So if the allocation has to perform the compensation in a short period of time, the percent will rise. It's just a very simple piece of algebra. And we saw, for instance, that in our analysis that an 8% allocation, if it were to be a constant allocation just for 10 years and then phase out, would require rising up to about 50% allocation in order to achieve the exact same amount of compensation to the exact same businesses with the exact same policy. So that's one important area. Another one is that the percent, whatever it is, 15% or 50% is in the case of that other estimate, is based on the average of a sectoral impact. And there are many businesses in a sector, and these models work with very, very aggregated sectors. One sector is the entire electricity generating sector, rather than all the types of generators, some of which emit carbon and some don't. Another is all of energy-intensive sectors, which includes many, many diverse types of manufacturing all into one, because they all happen to use a lot of energy in their production processes. They have very different marketplaces. Some of them may benefit under a market, a carbon market, and some may lose. If you try to estimate what the impact would be to the sector on average, you may find that you need no compensation, 0%. But in fact, if you say, well, if you look behind those numbers, you find that has assumed that you've taken the profits from the winning companies, compensated the losing companies in the sector with those profits that they'll never get their hands on, and then take it, and then only say, what do we need in addition to further offset the overall sectoral losses? So in one analysis, we found a 0% needed allocation to compensate a group of businesses. Actually, if you looked at the need to compensate each of the individual losers without taking profits away from the winners, translated into 30% allocations. So those are two very critical ones. Also, the models are very poor at estimating whether certain companies can actually pass their costs through to customers. The models assume a good deal of price pass-through, and that's simply not the case for some kinds of businesses, particularly those that are exposed to trade competition from foreign imports or exports. If they can't pass it through, they need a larger allocation to be made whole, because part of the reason you don't need to give 100% of the allocation to businesses is because a lot of the business costs do get passed through to the consumer. And that will happen, as we said. Prices of energy will go up, and it will get passed through in many cases to consumers as higher costs of goods and services.
Dr. Orszag, would you like to respond briefly?
Sure. I would first note that the paper that talks about this from CBO was issued under my predecessor, Douglas Holtz-Eakin. I have reviewed that. I think that the depiction therein is entirely accurate. It does distinguish between net effects on the sector and compensating individual firms, and I don't think that there was anything misleading at all in CBO's presentation. I'd also note a deeper question, though, which is in many discussions of compensation for losses, there is a level of aggregation that's undertaken. Mr. Greenstein, for example, talked about compensating low-income households. That was an average across all sorts of low-income households, some of whom will lose more and some of whom will lose less. If you compensate low-income households on average, you're not going to hit each individual household exactly, nor do I think it's even possible for you to do so. So it is often the case in this kind of setting that there is a level of aggregation done and an impossibility of reaching in and compensating each individual household or each individual firm for the effects imposed on them. If you tried to do that, I think you would wind up with a bigger administrative mess than administering the cap and trade program itself.
Thank you very much. Now let's, Dr. Donahue, did you want to say something?
Just one quick point. The whole premise that the company's shareholders need to be compensated is based on an assumption that this program is coming and hitting them as a surprise. But we've known for a long time that global warming is a problem, and smart investors have known that there were risks associated in holding positions in companies with a lot of carbon exposure. I'm not sure that it's, I'm not saying that we oppose using a share of the allowance proceeds for some sort of transitional assistance to companies in the fossil fuel industry. I'm not saying that NRDC completely opposes that, but I do think that it shouldn't be taken as a given that they are owed this, because like everybody else, they have been on notice that global warming is a problem and legislation is a coming.
Thanks, sir.
And
Mr. Ryan.
one quick point also, since I was also accused, my testimony along with Dr. Orszag's, of being a little misleading here. As Dr. Orszag said, our estimate of a 14% of the allowances to offset the effects on low-income households, there'd be winners and losers in that. If I tried to give you an estimate of how to do something you could administer that identified every single low-income household in the United States and made them whole, it would cost more, but that's not feasible. And it doesn't occur to me that it has been the policy over time of the U.S. government, every time it institutes a new policy in any area, to try to identify every individual firm in the United States that may be affected by a change in policy or regulation and fully compensate it. It's not feasible. The other point is it's certainly true that if you phase out the allocation of permits to energy companies after something like 10 years, then your initial percentage would need to be higher than 15%. The 15% figure that CBO talked about, and we're just citing their figure, is a steady state figure. You can do 15% in perpetuity, or you can do a somewhat higher percentage initially and phase it down to zero over time. There's nothing misleading there. You just take your choice on how you do it.
Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Chairman. This is a good hearing and a good debate, and something we need to do a lot more of. Unfortunately, some of us are on Ways and Means. We're in the middle of a markup. We have amendments coming up, so we're going to be coming and going. I guess this debate shows you that, you know, modeling is a crude science still, and these sectors, you know, wide, aggregate-wide, economy-wide models are tough and crude and difficult to measure. And so when we put in place policies that are so prescriptive, it's really difficult to measure the outcomes. And so that's why I want to get into this, the debate about if we do cap and trade and we don't have a safety valve on leakage, then what are the consequences? If we do have a safety valve, if we do have a safety valve, then we still lose emissions. Either way you go, because of foreign competition, it seems to me going down the cap and trade route, and if we take Mr. Donnelly's recommendation and don't have any price protection, don't have a safety valve, then you'll have a lot of leakage, at which planetarily wise, you're going to have a reduction in your goals. So, but if you do have leakage protection, or you do allow leakage, if you do allow a price ceiling, then you're going to reduce your goals either way. So the point is, why don't we have more discussion about a carbon tax instead of a cap and trade? If we're going to spend all of our time building a big mousetrap to try and reach the goal of cap and trade, isn't a better, more efficient, less economically damaging route a tax? I think the Mankiw article that I think, Bob, you mentioned, which I agree, if you just take benefits out of the economy and give to a few, you're clearly giving something that is more valuable. It is, corporate welfare is probably a good way of describing it. But at the same time, I think Greg also mentioned maybe we ought to look at a tax that's international, and therefore you can have global adjustments, border adjustments. So here's my quick question to everybody, and then Peter, I have a scoring question I want to ask you, and then I'll turn over. Why, those of you who are advocating cap and trade, why is it that you think this is so much better than a tax, if given we had to do all of these things to try and police a cap and trade, which seem to me are going to escape us and we will not meet our goals?
Could I take the first whack at that?
Sure.
First of all, there is, I think, well, let me go back to the beginning. There's a distinction to be made between the volatility problem, prices going up and down year to year, and the long-term cost. The volatility problem, in my experience in talking with people from the industries, is the thing that really kills people. If their costs are predictable, they can adjust to them. And so how do you deal with volatility? Well, the primary way to avoid volatility in a cap and trade program is with banking, which means that if prices are low in a year, you control more and you save up the allowances. And borrowing, if costs are high, you can borrow from the future under an interest-based repayment. And that can have the capacity to smooth out this year-to-year volatility. If you had the ability during the spike in natural gas prices to have borrowed and used natural gas that wouldn't be pumped from the ground until 2020, it would have dampened the price of 2006 natural gas. You can do that with allowances because you can shift them in time. So I don't think the volatility problem is as serious a problem, or it has a cure, without going to the safety valve. Second point I would make is that your question and Dr. Smith's observation assumes a very long period in which the United States is doing its thing on global warming all by itself, and other countries are not coming along. Well, first of all, except for Australia, the rest of the industrial world is already ahead of us, and we would be joining them rather than leading them. Secondly, there are provisions in several of the bills to create more leverage for bargaining with key developing countries by proposing that there should be border pollution purchase requirements, like a border tax adjustment, if after a number of years key countries don't have comparable control requirements. As someone who has worked in the international negotiations as well as the domestic arena, I think the time actually has come where the developing countries are ready to respond if and when we lead. And so it will come together in the next 5 to 10 years, and you won't have that sort of thing. On the last point on the tax, what the atmosphere sees is the number of tons that go into it. That's what causes global warming. So we need a direct, in my opinion, a direct limit on the amount of pollution that goes into the atmosphere. When you use a tax approach, you're guessing at how much response there will be in terms of what pollution levels will go in. And it's not easy to write a tax. Everyone has their own different provisions and sub-provisions and loopholes and this and that's. It's not any less complicated than writing a cap and trade program, and you have to keep adjusting the amounts to get the results you want.
Well, I would simply say constructing a border adjustment regime on a cap and trade program that's WTO compliant, I think, would be a lot more difficult than if you did it on a tax. You know, we did DISC and FISC and all of these iterations to try and become, and now in ETI and now where we are, we've had a hard time just with existing trade law and tax policy complying with WTO. I think there's a case to be made that this would be very difficult because we're worldwide and the rest of the countries are territorial. Our tax regimes are so different. We would have a very hard time, I would think, constructing a WTO compliant border adjustability regime under a cap and trade program than if we did it under a tax system. And I know you're not a tax guy. I think the other folks here are, but go ahead, Bob. And then just one quick question, Peter, I want to ask you about scoring.
It seems to me one way to think of this is think of three alternatives, carbon tax, cap and trade. The third alternative is doing nothing, sticking with what we have now. Now, clearly, by far the worst alternative is doing nothing. The difference between that and either cap and trade or a carbon tax is vastly greater than the difference between a carbon tax and a cap and trade. So I would agree with you that if we could either do a cap and trade or a carbon tax, I would prefer a carbon tax. My concern is that the political system, I think, would have a real all of you and your colleagues, a much harder time enacting a carbon tax than a cap and trade system. I wish that weren't true. That certainly is true today. Maybe it won't be true
right, but
in a
taking
couple
politics
of years.
aside, in theory, in the policy vacuum, you're saying a carbon tax is the better way to go than a cap and trade
In a
program.
policy vacuum, I would prefer a carbon tax, but I have a very strong fear that if one tried to move it, those who advocated it would be immediately attacked as tax increasers, and the whole thing would fall apart and we'd end up with nothing. So in the ideal world with no politics, I'd prefer a carbon tax, but I don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Peter, in the name.
Well, I first want to point out banking is not a way to reduce volatility. There's banking in the Point out banking is not a way to remove volatility. There was an enormous amount of banking allowed and used in the SO2 cap, and yet we've seen huge volatility in that market. Just in the past couple of years, prices rose in the space of 12 months from $400 per ton of SO2 up to $1,500 a ton, and then plummeted back down to the range of about $500 a ton. And you've hit it on the mark about the tax. For the WTO compliance, a tax allows a much easier and immediate, without delay, implementation of a border tax adjustment that would be WTO compliant or very likely to, much more likely than anything that's been proposed around the cap and trade schemes. Taxes are maybe complicated to implement into law, to enact into law and write, but I think we're seeing that cap and trade is complicated to enact and write into law. Just have a look at the length of the Lieberman-Warner bill. So, but once you get it implemented, and it's pretty easy to know if it's a simple one or not, once you get it implemented, then you have all the benefits of simplicity associated with the tax, in addition to the international trade side of it. Thank you.
Okay, Peter, answer that question, then I'll tack this on at the end. Your written testimony, you go into, sort of scoring rules that you're going to put down. If we send you a bill, one that auctions, how will you score that? If we send you a bill that does not auction, that gives the allowances away, how is that going to be scored?
Let me answer that question first. As my written testimony notes, if you auction the permits, that would be scored as a revenue. If you gave the permits away, there is a solid case to be made that that should be scored as a revenue and a corresponding outlay with no net effect on the deficit. That would be a departure from the way that the sulfur dioxide program, for example, was scored, and it would be a departure from the fact that the budget is primarily cash-based. On the other hand, again, there is a very solid argument to be made that that would be the most insightful scoring to put equivalent transactions on an equal footing in the scoring process.
You can't be a two-handed economist when you're CVO director, though. You'll have to make a decision.
Within a very short period of time, we'll have to make a decision.
And you have yet to do that.
We have not yet formally done that. Again, I would just say there is a solid case to be made for treating the permits that are given away as both a revenue and an outlay.
So no net effect.
No net effect on the budget. However, it would be the benefit of that kind of approach is it would make it transparent what was happening. And in particular, again, repeating the equivalent, giving someone permits worth $100 that they can immediately turn around and sell for cash is effectively equivalent to selling the permits for $100 and then giving that person or firm $100 in cash. Scoring the permits that are given away as a revenue and an outlay would make that those equivalent transactions equivalent in the scoring process. And for transparency and so that policymakers can evaluate the trade-offs clearly, there is a solid case to be made for that kind of scoring.
Okay. Then on the, because I know you do tax as you dabble there, is it easier for us to concoct a border adjustability regime that's WTO compliant based on a tax versus a cap and trade system? And give me your take on the efficiencies of achieving the end goal between the two.
First, as my testimony makes clear, a tax is generally more efficient than a cap and trade system. You can make a cap and trade system sort of approach the efficiency of a tax by making it by changing its design features, so banking and borrowing, and then a safety valve, as you noted. And so, relatively speaking, a tax is more efficient, but a cap and trade can approach the efficiency of a tax with design features that I mentioned. On the border tax adjustments and WTO compatibility, I would say the area of adjustments in a cap and trade system at the border is has ambiguities associated with it. When I was before I joined CBO, I had done some work in the area, and I would just say that is a particularly complicated area in which I wouldn't want to make predictions about what exactly is or is not WTO compliant.
Thank you.
Mr. Saunders, welcome. Do you have any questions? Okay. Mr. Tiberi. Tiberi?
Smith.
I beg your pardon.
That's right. Just guess. Thank you very much for your time here. I know that it gets to be a challenge balancing science and politics and economics, and I appreciate your efforts. In trying to read up on so much of this, it's been interesting to see, and especially for my district, a large producer of livestock. Mm-hmm. And I've read about the impacts of high corn prices. Not only high corn prices on the prices in livestock, but across the food spectrum, if you will, around the world. There are pluses and minuses along the way, but would especially the criticisms of the livestock industry relating to carbon, would situations be considered, Mr. Orzog, if you don't mind, if with a cap and trade system, would the increased costs of food production be considered in this equation?
There would be a variety of effects that would be spread out across different sectors, and the agricultural sector in particular would experience effects. I'd also note the agricultural sector would be one of the sectors most affected by a changing climate, so you also need to weigh the costs and benefits. And beyond that, I would just point out that your example might be a particularly salient one to return to the scoring issue. Handing a farmer a permit worth $100 that the farmer then turns around and sells for cash of $100 is really similar to handing that farmer $100 in cash. So you're right to identify your district and the agricultural sector in particular as a key sector in climate change. It's often noted that methane emissions are tied to the agricultural sector, and that's one of the greenhouse gases. And there would be important effects that are part of all of these models that strive as best they can to identify potential impacts on particular sectors.
Go ahead.
May I add a couple of points? First, that most cap and trade bills don't suggest they would actually control the emissions from most agricultural activities. But the change in the markets for energy means that there will be even larger opportunities for farm-based energy production. And this is apart from allocation subsidies or other subsidies. It just becomes more valuable to make wind energy, to recover methane, natural gas, from the wastes of livestock production, to grow, we would hope, cellulosic products, not the corn, but the stalks, switchgrasses, and so on, and turn those into ethanol. So you get an increase in farm-related energy markets just from the imposition of a cap. And there can also be, inside the distribution of the allowances, there can be incentives to make some of those technologies come forward faster.
Okay. Dr. Smith?
I'd like to also point out agriculture is one of the most energy-intensive forms of manufacturing we have in the U.S. It's up there with other energy-intensive sectors. Cost of energy, when it rises, will raise the cost of farming. There's no question, though, that there may be some opportunities if the world is shifting towards biomass-based ethanol and use of land for forestry. There will be a higher, rises and changes in markets for land, as well as change in markets for the crops off of the land. And I think it creates as much uncertainty. There could be some upside for farmers, but it could also be a pretty disruptive time. At the same time, all the input prices are changing.
I think you might have been reading a transcript of some conversations I had with constituents. I appreciate your bringing that up because agricultural producers, their greatest concern right now is the cost of energy, and with the direct impact that a cap-and-trade system would probably have on the energy costs, it would even exacerbate the problem that I see. When we look at the larger issue again, are we confident that those who would be most impacted across the board, whether it's individuals, whether it's companies, whether it's those on fixed income paying their utility bills, that we can truly address all those? I know that's an ambiguous question, but I'm fearful that there might be some unintended consequences along the way. If Mr. Greenstein would respond.
Sort of following up on an earlier comment I made, if the question is could we identify every individual firm or elderly person on a fixed income or farmer and fully offset the impact, no, we can't do it for each individual one. We've never done that for any big policy the government's ever implemented. What we can do, though, is we can identify the priority needs, and if we auction off the lion's share of the permits, the resources are there. One can design in an efficient manner how to provide the assistance in those areas. Now, clearly, you're not going to be able to fully offset the impact on everyone. If you took every consumer at all income levels and fully offset the cost on all of them, you wouldn't have money for basic research, or you might not have enough to go deeper in the coal mining communities. You make some choices, but the amount of revenue that can be raised, whether it be through auctioning permits or a carbon tax, as Mr. Ryan suggested, is sufficient that Congress could identify all the priority needs it needed to address, and it could, on average, fully address the needs in each of those areas, whether it be energy companies, people on fixed incomes, low-income consumers, or the like.
Mr. Smith, let me just add that it is not possible to compensate each individual household or each individual firm precisely because there is an overall economic cost to acting. That overall economic cost means it's not a I don't want to call it a fool's quest, but it's not possible to compensate everyone for the effects because there is some net cost. However, that cost has to be weighed against the benefit of purchasing insurance against climate change, basically. And so attempts to fully compensate everyone for the economic costs involved are not going to succeed almost by definition, but the net cost that that sort of will be there needs to be weighed against the benefit of reducing the risk of potentially catastrophic climate change.
I would like to add, I completely agree. There's a net cost. That was my starting point. The different forms of allocations can maybe help find a way to smooth out where the impacts are, but there's no way to make everybody better off, even if you get a fully smooth and equitable sort of distribution. But I also want to point out, yes, we need to try to weigh the costs against the benefits, and we need to look at the costs that I just showed, reported in my statement. Those are the net costs after accounting for all the recycling of all the benefits associated with the revenues from the allocations. And so the net average cost to the household for the kinds of hard cap bills that we're looking at, without accounting for the uncertainty and volatility, is in the range of $1,000 to $1,500 a year.
But again, that doesn't include
that's what needs to be compared against the benefits
from climate.
From
right.
the climate.
So it's not net.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really want to thank the witnesses here today. This has been very interesting and I think a very productive debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Berry. One final question of Mrs. Smith. Would you take just a minute and explain to what extent that CRA's analyses, your analyses, take into account the economic benefits of imposing climate control, particularly with respect to avoiding environmental harm and even catastrophic consequences?
As I just said, those are the costs that need to be evaluated against the benefits. So they do not include the environmental benefits. Instead, they provide you a sense of what you would be spending at different emissions targets. And then one can ask, what do we gain from those emission targets? I'd just take a moment to mention that some of these catastrophic changes, if they are happening now, the risk of them will not be changed by any of these carbon policies.
So
we can change the amount of future warming that might occur with deep cuts on a global basis. But the kinds of changes we're talking about in those cap and trade programs that the U.S. is undertaking would not be able to avert any catastrophic losses that are already in the works. They don't make enough change in the climate forecast.
Dr. Donegan.
Thank you, Congressman. Just first, what we're sketching out is the U.S. part of a balanced world program to cut back the global warming pollution that's not yet in the atmosphere. And the IPCC and many other analysts see increasingly dire future consequences as the temperature goes up. If we had it in our power, we would keep the temperature from going up at all. But there's some increase coming from the pollution already in the bank, already in the air, and from the activities that we need to turn around that won't be turned around overnight. So the goal, at least from the environmental community, is to draw as much as we can a bright line against letting the temperature increase over where we are now go on a global average up another 2 degrees Fahrenheit or more than that. It's true, as Dr. Smith said, that there are impacts occurring now, and it's unfortunately true, that are resulted from the global warming pollution already in the atmosphere, changing the frequency of droughts and storms and some of the other bad events. Not every fire, not every hurricane, obviously, is caused by global warming, but you're changing the number of dots on the dice and changing the outcome as we roll the future climate dice. We have no alternative but to cut back emissions now in order to stave off the impacts we have not yet committed to. If we just keep letting it go, it just gets worse and worse.
But in your quotes, Mr. Greenstein.
I was just going to say, we need numbers to help guide us in work, especially those of us who deal with the budgets. One problem we sometimes run into is for things that we do not have enough data to quantify, we run the risk of ignoring or acting like there is zero. In this case, the thing we can't quantify is the economic damage, and how you would average it per household, of doing nothing. Now, think of let me be clear, I'm not an expert on Hurricane Katrina. I don't know to what degree that was climate change related, but for sake of illustration, suppose over the next 50 years there were a series of events like that could have been averted if we took strong action to address climate change. The potential economic impacts of those would be very large. And if we knew the number, we could quantify it per household. We can't do it because we can't possibly predict what that is. We can't come up with a number. But it doesn't mean the number's zero. And there's a very substantial chance that that number is substantially larger than all the numbers we're talking about here today of the potential effect per household because of what would be relatively modest impacts on the economy.
Mr. Taber.
For the record, it's Mr. Smith, but that's okay.
I beg your pardon.
That's right.
It's the chairman's birthday.
If each of you...
I became a doctor. You had a wholly new name.
I know you're not scientists, but we're trying to balance all of this right here. If those who would wish to state on a scale of 1 to 100 the certainty of reversing global warming with a cap-and-trade program.
Let me take the first cut at this. The analysis by the IPCC scientists, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and by others, is that the kind of emission reduction pathway that I'm talking about, 15% reduction by 2020, 80% reduction in the U.S. by 2050, if matched by other developed countries, and there's a lot of those countries that are ahead of us, and if not exactly the same action, but proportionate action is taken to moderate emissions growth in developing countries and ultimately to reduce it, that sketches out a budget, an atmospheric carbon budget, that is consistent with avoiding the 2-degree increase or worse that I described. And that's the physics, that's the budget of the atmosphere that we're bringing to this economic budget hearing.
Anyone else wishing to respond?
There's no question, if we were to stop the growth of the CO2 emissions and the other greenhouse gases going into the future or through this century, that we would reduce the amount of warming that will occur otherwise. But we're not going to reverse the warming that is occurring now without waiting another century or so. So there's a certain amount that's committed, it's not going to get reversed. Then the question is, with these expenditures, what will we do in the way of reducing further growth? There's a serious issue here where we don't have developing countries involved and their emissions aren't being reined in, and there's nothing in a hard cap on the U.S. that actually brings them into the fold. In fact, they have more and more incentive not to come into the fold as we put tighter and tighter caps on ourselves unilaterally because they gain competitive advantages over it. So the real issue is, can we get a globally coordinated reduction in those greenhouse gas emissions? And just putting a cap on the U.S. emissions and bearing these costs in the near term isn't going to accomplish that. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to take some action in the U.S. to start to put in effect a cost-effective climate policy that will start to move us in the direction of getting towards zero emissions over the next century. Us, and by us, I'm sorry, I mean the whole globe. and that's the other point I've been making, is that these policies are more costly than they need to be in order to get us on that long-term, centuries-long action to prevent more greenhouse gas increase than is desirable.
Could I just add one thought, which is I think too much of the discussion about future climate change has focused on the expected outcome, the range of, say, 2 to 6 degrees Celsius, for example, and too little on what economists call the tail of the, but the small probability of really bad things happening. and that I would think that more attention, even though they're extraordinarily difficult to quantify or even know what the risk is, more attention to that risk would be beneficial in evaluating the pros and cons of moving forward rather than just the sort of expected outcomes, because there's an important element of insurance here against that kind of catastrophic risk.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Now, I believe that concludes the hearing. I have one final detail. Any members who did not have the opportunity to ask questions, I ask unanimous consent they be given 7 days to submit questions for the record. Without objection, so ordered. Thank you very much for your testimony and your lively presentation. We appreciate it, and we've learned a lot. Thank you
very much. And happy birthday.
Thank you, sir.